So I get to lead today for this week's Village Torah, and welcome to that this week. I am the Summer TJF Fellow, Edie Yakutis, and graciously invited to lead by Cedar Village's chaplain, Rabbi Drew Kaplan. Hello, Rabbi Drew. And off we go. And of course, we have Deb Rosen, who is one of our valiant and continual I was going to say student, but I would say student and teacher. So this week's portion is the second portion of Deuteronomy, the final book of Torah. And the portion is VaEthanan, which is Hebrew for and he pleaded, actually it's and I pleaded. Sorry, looking over at my trusty Tanakh, because one should never be too far from one's Tanakh. What we're going to talk about this week, though, is not overall Moses's, I guess I would call it his first speech. Would you also call it his first speech, Rabbi Drew?
Well, here in the book of Devarim,
yeah,
talks in other places, but
that's a lot. But he's supposed to. He's got a great deal of knowledge, and he wants to share that. So what we're going to talk about, though, this week is something I think we might take for granted. We hear it frequently, every service pretty much, which is the Shema. And the Shema and the VaEthanan are actually fully given here in Deuteronomy. And I thought we would talk a little bit about the Shema itself, its history, and some of the minhagim, or what's the better word, habits, traditions that go with it. I should be sharing my screen. I hope you can see that.
Yep.
And what we're looking at is the Shema from the Mishkan Tefillah, which is a Reform Siddur, and it takes up 2 whole pages in the book. It goes right across the center, and it has the whole thing. Shema Israel, well, the Shema whole thing. Shema Israel, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, Baruch Shem Kavod, Malchuto, Le'olam Ba'ed. Hear, O Israel, Adonai is our God, Adonai is one, blessed is God's glorious majesty forever and ever. And so we're going to go through sort of, what is it? Where did we know now where we got it from, Deuteronomy. And what are we really, how has it come through the ages with us? Shema is only one of 2 prayers that are specifically commanded in the Torah. And I may be wrong on this, Rabbi Drew, but I was looking this up, and the other one that's actually explicit is to give thanks for food, Birkat Hamazon. So grace after meals. And am I right?
It's also in Deuteronomy.
And that it is also in Deuteronomy, because I've always thought it's a little bit out of character for humans to give thanks after eating. But to give thanks before and after, I think, is something that is amazing. But back to Shema, this is our oldest fixed prayer, really and truly. It's daily. We are commanded to recite it morning and night, and we'll see why about that in a minute. And where we see that is right here. And we're not going to do an entire slideshow, I do promise. But from Deuteronomy, chapter 6, verses 4 through 7, and you see right there, impress them upon your children in verse 7. Recite them when you stay at home, when you walk along the way, when you lie down, and when you get up. Shema was compiled. I'm going to stop sharing here for a moment. Let me see if I can get that to work quickly. Shema was actually compiled and started really being used during the Second Temple period. And from my research, it's one of those wonderful prayers that, while Jews do love community, you don't actually need a minyan to recite it. Community, of course, is always preferred because I think there is strength in the prayers together. And the term, the Shema, is actually used pretty much for the whole thing. The Shema VaEthanan. And they're actually in the Torah in a number of places. This week's VaEthanan, Akev, which I think is next week or the week after, and Shlach. All 3 sections of Torah actually have that, the prayer in there. So then, where should we say it? I mean, that's a valid question.
You mean where physically?
Yeah,
Where physically?
where and when. So if we know it's morning and night, when you lie down and when you get up, where does one actually say it? Is there a specific place? I'm being quiet and letting you think for
I
half a
think, well, my answer would be wherever you feel closest to God.
and maybe as the times hit. Because, I mean, think about it. What the Torah says, I think you're right, Deb. You recite them when you're staying at home, when you're walking along the way, when you're lying down, and when you get up. So
Right.
this is where, go ahead.
Right.
Yeah. And Josephus, Flavius Josephus was a historian, actually wrote in his book way back in early Christian era, 93 or 94. He wrote in his book, Antiquities of the Jews, "Let everyone commemorate before God the benefits which he bestowed upon them. And the Jews say this twice every day, both when the day begins and when the hour of sleep comes on." What's interesting is that later continued to be codified. And Rabbi Drew, if you want to talk a little bit about the Shulchan Aruch, which is in fact, you want to talk a little bit about the Shulchan Aruch and what that is, because I know that you actually have read it a great deal more than I have, but what they're talking about in reference to the sort of different, is it halakha, or is it encouragement, recommended?
It's meant as halakha.
Excellent. So what that outlines, go ahead.
So yeah, Rabbi Yosef Karo was living in Turkish land, the Ottoman Empire, and in the early 16th century, he wrote what was called the set table, Shulchan Aruch, and it had, it worked. I could go more into it, but basically what he did was this is a simplified sort of arrangement of laws, which is not to be confused with his earlier, much more voluminous work, which I like to call Joe's house, or the house of Joseph. So his Beit Yosef is a description, is a commentary on the Torah, which was written by Yaakov ben Harosh. And anyways, that's a whole other conversation. But this was meant for a quick little study. It's not the voluminous, lengthy, all that stuff. The Shulchan Aruch is much more pithy and is really meant as like a jumping off point for further study. So it's much more for committing to memory, or at least, easily learnable stuff. And
go ahead.
Well, it was really prompted by the advent of the printing press. So that's why it was in the early 16th century, is they finally had this accessibility to distribute at scale content. And so the printing press was really it was an incredible unlock for them, and they were able to. That's why we see, and Rabbi Cairo was actually not the only one working on this time. He just happened to be the first, and it got basically established as that. And then everybody else had to pretty much do their commentaries there upon this set table work, this Shulchan Aruch.
And see, what's wonderful about the Shulchan Aruch, everything I've been reading on it lately, is it's simple. It nets it out. So instead of opening it up for huge amounts of arguments, which some of the other sages much earlier, when things were still in manuscript, this one is the Shema may be recited walking, standing, lying down, riding on your animal, or just sitting. The Shema may not be recited if you're lying face down or face up, but if you're lying on your side, that's okay. If one is corpulent or cannot roll over on their side, or if one is ill, you should slightly incline to the side. So that's, try to do this in the proper way so that you are both showing respect and, again, taking part in what your community is doing, even if you're alone. In fact, there's in one of the writings of the sages, the Mishnah, there's a very lengthy description of if the fruit pickers in the tree, did they come down from the tree at the time to recite Shema? And the general consensus was they don't, because it's as you are, on your way. As a result, you almost have no excuse not to recite Shema and the VaEthanan, and that's the core tenet, the core watchwords of our faith. I mean, that's what we hear most Fridays and Saturdays. At least that's sort of a description as we come into it. So, okay, we know sort of what it is, where we can say it, which I like how you put it, Deb, at the proper time and when you are close to God. The official times to say that are the morning services, the evening services. It's kind of tradition to do it at the bedtime Shema. We also hear part of the Shema, not the entire VaEthanan, on Torah services. So on holidays or on Shabbat Torah service. Rabbi Drew, are there other times when Shema or any variation of it that you can think of are shared?
The main times for Shema, well, in addition to the morning and evening stuff, you mentioned it, we say it then, Torah service is pretty much it. I mean, it's part of the Rosh Hashanah liturgy as one of the, it's included in the Malchiot section, the sort of the coronation aspects of that set of blasts. Not a whole lot of other times, but it is seen as this central, really simple declaration of our king, crowning the king.
Mhm.
I often have heard, because I do love to go to different synagogues for services, it's pronounced or said differently. Sometimes it's very Shema and it's one breath each time, for a breath per word. I have also heard where the D from Echad is really, really emphasized. And I was trying to look through my different Sidurim in reference to the printing, because I know that some Sidurim have the Dalet as a much larger letter, which I've always found interesting. And that's something I've been looking at. Part of that is the letters, the last letter of the first and last words are written larger. And that's because the letters form the word ed, or witness. And it's to remind Jews of their duty to serve as witnesses to God's sovereignty, which I found extremely interesting. And I've definitely heard some folks in different synagogues pronounce it that way. And now that I've sort of read this in books, which to me is somehow a little more realistic and authoritative than, just some internet random thing, or has more weight. So now we get to the discussion part. All right, because now we have the customs of Shema. Remember, we can recite it lying down, on our sides, of course, sitting up, riding on our animal. I assume that means a car as well as perhaps a horse or a donkey. In trees. Different synagogues have different customs. As a student rabbi, I have served now at 3 or 4 different synagogues over the past 2.5 years. And I have learned, you will say, please rise or remain seated as is your custom, at which point sometimes half the kahal will rise. Where I was this past year, about half the synagogue rose, excuse me, for the Shema, and then would sit right back down for the VaEthanan. And others sitting in the same room did not rise at all. And I always found that interesting. Deb, in your times when you've gone to various synagogues and various services, did you have a preference? What would you do on your own if given your own minhag to make?
I would stand, because in standing, it's a prayer to God, right? It's a prayer to God, and that would show respect. Now, in our synagogue or our temple here, the rabbi indicates either you can stand or sit according to your custom. But my custom is to stand.
Mine has been half and half, and lately, because of Zoom, because think about it, we pretty much had only Zoom services since March.
That's right.
If I'm not leading, I stand for that exact same reason. It's like I want to feel more connected. And as I think about Jews globally reciting the Shema, because I imagine that whenever I'm saying it, the rest of the Jews on the planet are also saying it with me. Okay, not really, but it would be wonderful. That somehow we're all elevating ourselves.
Right.
One of the synagogues I was teaching Sunday school at this past year, the rabbi there did acknowledge that not everyone was going to stand, but she said, rise up in your heart, which is something I find also very, very meaningful.
Yes.
Rabbi Drew, in your experiences, what have you seen or experienced for Shema?
Sitting, always sitting.
Really?
Yeah, at least in more traditional settings, Orthodox settings, it's always sitting. No one ever stands. Yeah, no one ever stands.
Well, and I've read it's because it's as if they're studying.
Could just be, now I'm speculating, that to emphasize the standing nature of the standing prayer, the Amidah, standing. And I like what you said, Edie, is the sitting, maybe because it's more of like a study aspect, because you're saying the Shema, which is more of a Torah study aspect. It could be. Yeah. And I think it has to do with, I don't know if I know you didn't explicitly reference it, but one of the late Second Temple understandings of in your rising and your laying down is one of the late Second Temple understandings of how to understand the verse of in your lying down and in your rising up. How much of it was a temporal understanding, meaning it's a timing when people go down to sleep and when people rise up, and how much of it is a choreographical understanding, meaning you should be rising, you should be standing when you say the Shema in the morning, and you should be lying down when you say the Shema in the evening. And so ultimately the one that won out was not the choreographical understanding, but it was the temporal understanding, which ultimately won out. But that really the choreographical aspect of necessarily standing or sitting is really less important.
I think as long as you still do it, and preferably with company.
Yeah.
Now the next question, because this one is one of my favorites. I used to all very dramatically cover my eyes. And many people do cover their eyes when they are saying Shema. And I thought to do this, I will share my screen yet again, because part of it comes from a historic story. When one of our first great sages, Rabbi Yehudi Hanassi, Judah the Prince, when he would be in the study hall and it was time for Shema, he would pass his hands over his face as he accepted the yoke of the kingdom of heaven, which is the Shema, as his Shema as was being said. And there are a number of stories where other rabbis subsequently said because his students would distract him, or otherwise, they didn't say annoy, but having been a teacher with, teenage boys, they can be distracting even when they're being very serious studying. And then later in the Shulchan Aruch, it sort of became again codified. Place your hands over your faces during the recitation so that you don't see anything, so that you're truly able to focus on the words and having that proper intention as you're reciting it. Because it is so simple. Listen, God is one. The end, pretty much. And he is ours, or we are his. There's a number of different explanations. There was one later, 16th century in Prague, Rabbi Ezekiel Landau, who noted in a perhaps more sad way that it's difficult to have the intention and the purity of statement of the Shema if you're looking at the pain in the world around us, which these days I can relate to, because there is so much distraction, excuse me, and ease of losing one's focus, so that when you are reciting Shema in the morning or the evening or at any other point in the day, it's easier to shut the world out just a little bit, don't you think?
Yeah.
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 And I'm not going to go on to the rest of the Via Hafta. However, this is one of those interesting commandments. We have the commandment to recite the Shema. However, in more orthodox strands of Judaism, women aren't obligated. They're not obligated to do the time-bound commandments. And the Shema would qualify for that because, again, it's got the temporal aspect to it, which Rabbi Drew notes, that whole morning and evening. And women were exempt from having to do it, but they weren't actually barred. They weren't forbidden. It just wasn't required. Now, I cannot speak to modern Orthodox, but I have seen it in the more classic strands. Conservative Judaism, it seems to me, from what I have observed, my practice has in general not been conservative Judaism, but that women are obligated. Rabbi Drew, do you have any insight on that one?
The conservative movement, I don't have any insights on that as far as I think there's been an egalitarian so far as I've noticed. I'm not an expert on conservative Jewry, but
Yeah.
you try to, level up the playing field as far as also obligating women in various commandments that are positive time-bound commandments.
Yes. And then for reform and reconstructionist movements, they tend to not accept any of those sort of time-bound, gender-related traditional requirements. Those have been sort of said, well, that was appropriate for that time, and this is a time that we don't, rationally think we need to do that. What is interesting to me is when I went to Lithuania last 2 years ago at Passover, myself and another rabbinic student who was female, and our translator who is a Russian rabbinic student, female. So it was 3 women in Lithuania, which would be fondly called a more conservative state. And we're leading service. And afterward, we were approached by 2 women and 2 men who, through the translator, were like, well, we've never had an all-female service. It was very different because we used their prayer book, but we did a few insertions and a little extra poetry because it's Passover and for the service itself. And then we were actually, I think we were complimented in that this is okay, women, you can do this. I mean, I think it also helped that our translator spoke apparently beautiful Lithuanian and Russian, as well as her English. But it was one of those moments when I didn't even realize that there were 3 women standing on the bima leading, and that the congregation was primarily gentlemen. So that was one of those different moments that I hope I never forget. And that they didn't look shocked. They didn't look upset. They were, okay, we have 3 women. We're good, despite the fact we were leading the whole thing. And that's primarily what our study is today in reference to the Shema. I didn't go as deeply into the Via Hafta, although at some point perhaps we will next time this comes around. However, I just realized I won't be here for next week. This is my final week with Cedar Village. And however, Village Torah will continue with Rabbi Drew. Right, Rabbi Drew?
Right. That is right. Unless we can all of a sudden open up and just be meeting in person again. But I think for the time being, we'll stick with this Village Torah online format for the time being.
And I will have to miss next week and probably the week after, but I'm sure you'll invite me back once I'm able, right?
That'd be great. Love to have you
Presumptive close, y'all. If you just noticed that one, that's the presumptive close.
That's good.
Of course I can come back.
I know you have something else.
What is that?
A papyrus.
Do I get to show the papyrus after all? All right.
Yes.
So in case people haven't noticed, I am a rather massive history buff. And so I will share my screen because shockingly, I think we're somewhat psychic. I might have been looking forward to that. All right. So one of the things I think is amazing is the history of our religion and the fact we have so much information. The Cairo Geniza and the trove that is there may be something I eventually go to England to the libraries there to look through all of the stuff that Solomon Schechter got out. If I ever make it to, I think it's Boston and the Reconstructionist libraries, they have a number of boxes where they're still cataloging the trove of information that was found in the Cairo Geniza. And it's everything. What we're looking at right now, this little scratchy scrap of paper, is the Nash papyrus. This is this scratchy scrap of papyrus. It's amazing it even lasted. Papyrus being made from a plant. It's been dated to about 150 of the Common Era, so slightly after Josephus. And what they found all rolled up was this piece of paper, and it says, I am Adonai your God that brought you out of the land of Egypt. That should sound familiar, shouldn't it? You will have no other gods before me, and you will not make yourself for yourself an image. All of this is in Deuteronomy. It's actually in this week's portion. It talks about don't be making statues, not of birds, not of people. It's amazing when they write about this, because the fact that this little scratchy piece of paper, whoops, excuse me, you can tell I have some other stuff, has lasted, but on it as well. And it's right down toward the bottom. I'm trying to find it again. I normally have this highlighted, but it is Adonai, I am Adonai, hear Israel, Adonai is your God, Adonai is one, and you shall love your God with all of your heart. And that's Deuteronomy. That's everything we've been studying, and that is something, a teeny fragment that was purchased in about 1898. And it's called the Nash Papyrus because things like this always get named after the guy who bought them. W.L. Nash. He was the Secretary of Biblical Archaeology, and he was down in Egypt. And these fragments actually have been determined to have come from a single scroll. They can tell from the way the papyrus is made that it's one piece of paper. And he presented it to the Cambridge University Library, where it's been kept, and they've been sort of restoring that. Cambridge is also working with the Cairo Geniza fragments that they have to try and determine where all of this was. And the fact that this thing is 2,000 years old and has survived, somebody treasured it enough, or somebody treasured it enough to start with, and then it got put away and wasn't seen after that, is to me one of those, I don't know if it's a divine miracle, but it is an amazing blessing when pieces of our history come through like that. And it shows us the continuity, what we belong to, of our history, of our people. Because somebody walked around with that in their shoulder bag in 150 CE. So thank you for letting me share that one, Rabbi Drew.
Absolutely. I was surprised you hadn't included earlier. You were so passionate.
Well, I didn't know how much time was going to be, and it was one of those, I don't want to make people too crazy with my history things, and my love of it, because what is it we even talked about this last week? We don't tend to forget our history. We do tend to lionize some things. One of the things I actually find wonderful, and I don't have a picture of it at this exact moment, but right outside the Knesset in Israel is the giant menorah, and right in the middle of it is the Shema medallion. It's cast in bronze. And that was something I took a whole lot of pictures of, because even though that was not made, I mean, that's new. That's made, probably 1950, as the Knesset was coming truly into being. But those values that we have that have lasted 3,000 years, we have to keep teaching them, we have to keep learning them so that they continue to last. So that, thank you, is what we have for today.
All righty, my pleasure. Well, thank you so much, Edie. This is great to have you lead your final Village Torah here as part of your TJF Fellowship, Cedar Village this summer. So thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate everyone and their time. And you'll be hearing more from me, I'm quite sure, at least on Friday.
Awesome. Awesome. All right. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.